When you think about human genetics, you probably think about ancestry tests, family trees, and maybe some ideas about how different groups of people are genetically distinct from one another. But what if I told you that almost everything you've been taught about this topic is fundamentally incomplete or simply wrong? The story of human genetics isn't about dividing people into separate categories. It's actually about discovering how deeply connected we all are, how much variation exists within every population, and how the science we once used to justify racial hierarchies was never actually valid in the first place. For hundreds of years, people have tried to use genetics to prove that race is a real biological category. Scientists created elaborate classification systems. They measured skulls. They analyzed blood types. They ranked human populations by supposed levels of genetic purity. Entire political movements were built on the idea that genetics could prove some people were fundamentally superior to others. But then something happened that changed everything. Technology advanced. Geneticists gained the ability to actually read the human genome in complete detail. And when they did, the results were absolutely clear. The biological concept of race doesn't exist. More specifically, there is no genetic basis for dividing humanity into racial categories that have any scientific meaning. The most significant moment in this entire story happened in 2003 with the completion of the Human Genome Project. Scientists from around the world had spent over a decade and billions of dollars mapping out the entire genetic code that makes us human. When they finished, they made a stunning announcement. Humans are 99.9% identical at the DNA level. Think about that number for a moment. We're talking about every single human being on this planet. Whether you're from Africa, Europe, Asia, South America, Australia, or anywhere else on Earth, your DNA is identical to every other human's DNA in 99.9% of cases. The 0.1% variation that does exist isn't distributed along racial lines at all. In fact, there's more genetic variation between two people from the same geographic population than there is between someone from Africa and someone from Europe. This wasn't a controversial finding among actual geneticists. The scientific consensus became absolute and remains absolute today. There is no genetic basis for race. Race is not a biological category supported by genetics. This discovery should have ended the entire discussion. But here's where it gets interesting. Decades later, even with all this evidence, many people still believe that genetics proves racial categories are real and biologically meaningful. This disconnect between what science actually shows and what people believe reveals something important about how misinformation spreads and how difficult it can be to change deeply ingrained beliefs, even when the evidence is overwhelming. So what does genetics actually show us? To answer that question, we need to understand what genetic variation really is and how it actually distributes across human populations. When geneticists talk about genetic variation, they're talking about differences in DNA sequences between individuals. Every person has roughly 3 billion base pairs in their DNA. Most of these are identical across all humans. But in certain locations called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, individuals can have different versions of the genetic sequence. These differences matter for things like eye color, height, disease susceptibility, and how our bodies respond to different medications. The critical point that geneticists emphasize over and over again is that this genetic variation doesn't follow racial categories at all. When scientists analyzed genetic diversity using modern molecular techniques, they found that genetic distance between individuals is not predictable based on race or ethnicity. Instead, genetic similarity is better predicted by geography and ancestry patterns. Two people from the same region might be more genetically similar to each other than to someone from an adjacent region, but this has nothing to do with what we call race. It has to do with population history, migration patterns, and how long populations have been geographically separated. This brings us to one of the most fascinating discoveries in modern genetics: understanding human migration history. For a long time, scientists believed in a simplified model of human origins. They thought that modern humans emerged in Africa around 50 to 70,000 years ago, and then dispersed across the globe in relatively straightforward migration waves. This model was appealingly simple, but it wasn't correct. Recent research has completely overturned this understanding. In 2026, a major study published in Science magazine presented evidence that challenges the long-held idea of a single ancestral population in Africa. Instead, researchers found that early humans likely evolved from multiple intermingling populations over hundreds of thousands of years. Rather than a clean split where groups separated and diverged, these populations stayed connected, continuously exchanging genes even after they began to diverge around 120,000 to 135,000 years ago. This is incredibly significant because it reveals that human populations were never as isolated as we previously thought. Genetic mixing and intermixture have been constant features of human history since the very beginning of our species. The idea of genetically pure populations isn't just scientifically invalid today. It's also invalid throughout human history. There's no point in the past when human populations were ever separate enough to develop into truly distinct genetic types. This is one reason why the entire concept of measuring genetic purity or ranking populations by purity is completely meaningless. Another revelation comes from studying ancient DNA. Scientists have the ability to extract DNA from ancient remains, including bones and teeth that are thousands of years old. This has allowed researchers to trace how human populations moved, mixed, and changed over time. These studies consistently show that most ancient and modern populations are admixed, meaning they descended from multiple ancestral sources. A population that might seem genetically homogeneous today may actually represent the result of multiple migration waves, population movements, and mixtures that occurred over thousands of years. In southeastern Africa, for instance, researchers found evidence of 9,000 years of genetic continuity and complex population dynamics that reveal nothing like the simple racial categories we often imagine. The concept of genetic ancestry is also frequently misunderstood. When people take commercial ancestry DNA tests, they often interpret the results as proving they belong to specific racial or ethnic groups. But that's not actually what those tests are showing. Now, these tests work by comparing an individual's DNA to reference databases of people from different geographic regions. The results show geographic ancestry, not race. They tell you that some of your ancestors came from, say, West Africa or Northern Europe. But geographic origins and racial categories are completely different things. This matters because people often use ancestry test results to support ideas about racial identity in ways that don't actually align with what the science means. Now, let's talk about what the actual science says about genetic diversity and disease. One area where people often hear about genetic differences between populations is in discussions of disease risk and health outcomes. Some people assume that if genetic variation exists among populations, it must mean that different populations have different disease susceptibilities encoded in their genes. But here's what the research actually shows. Most genetic variation is not population-specific. Common disease-associated genetic variants are typically found across all major population groups. What does vary is the frequency of certain alleles, or versions of genes, between populations. But these frequency differences are usually small, and they exist on a continuum. They don't create clear boundaries between populations. What's more important than genetic variation in determining disease risk is the socially constructed aspect of race. Medical outcomes in different populations are strongly determined by access to health care, quality of health care, exposure to environmental toxins, stress levels, diet, housing conditions, education, and numerous other social and economic factors. For decades, medical researchers have mistakenly attributed these outcome differences to genetic differences between races. But when you actually look at the data, the social determinants of health explain far more variation than genetics does. A study published in 2003 in the journal JAMA examined the relationship between race and genetic influences on health and found that the assumption that race is a useful proxy for genetic ancestry in medicine is problematic and potentially harmful. This is why in 2024, editors across several major biomedical and genetics journals issued joint guidance advising that self-identified race and ethnicity should not be used as proxies for genetic ancestry groups in research. This was a major statement because it acknowledged that decades of medical research had been built on a fundamentally flawed assumption. The guidance emphasized that any population descriptors used in research should be justified in the methodology sections and should specifically explain why those descriptors were chosen. This move by major scientific journals represents a significant shift in how genetics research is being conducted and interpreted. One of the most important recent developments in genetics is an increased recognition of bias in genetic research itself. For years, the vast majority of genetic studies focused almost exclusively on people of European descent. As of 2024 and 2025, individuals of European descent still account for the overwhelming majority of participants in genome-wide association studies, or GAWAS. This creates a significant problem because findings derived primarily from European populations may not accurately apply to other populations. When scientists develop polygenic risk scores for disease prediction based primarily on European data, those scores often perform poorly when applied to people from other ancestries. This means that modern precision medicine and personalized healthcare based on genetics are currently less accurate for non-European populations. Recognizing this problem, scientists at Johns Hopkins University and other institutions have begun generating new catalogs of human gene expression data from around the world. These efforts aim to address the long-standing diversity bias in human genetics research. By including people from understudied populations, researchers hope to gain more accurate insights into genetic factors driving human diversity and how genes influence traits like height, hormone levels, and disease risk across all populations. This work represents a significant step toward more equitable and accurate genetic science. The concept of genetic ancestry itself is also more complex than most people realize. When scientists study ancestry, they're not looking for racial categories. Instead, they're using sophisticated computational methods to infer the geographic locations of shared ancestors. A method published in Science in 2025 capitalizes on genealogical information encoded in genomic tree sequences to trace the geographic history of genetic lineages. This approach reveals that ancestry is not a simple categorical thing. Instead, every individual's ancestry is a complex tapestry of countless ancestors from different places and times. Most people have genetic ancestry from multiple geographic regions, even if they're unaware of it. This fine-grained, continuous nature of genetic ancestry is utterly incompatible with the idea of discrete, pure racial groups. Understanding population structure also helps us see why racial categories don't match genetic reality. When geneticists analyze genetic variation using statistical methods to identify population clusters, they typically find that the clusters that emerge don't correspond to conventional racial categories. Instead, genetic clustering tends to reflect geographic proximity, historical migration patterns, and linguistic groupings. A person from Northern Europe might cluster genetically with someone from Asia Minor, even though conventional racial categories would place them in different groups. Similarly, people within continental Africa, often grouped as a single racial category, show more genetic variation and more distinct clustering patterns than people in Europe, even though Africa is a single continent. The case studies of ancestry DNA testing reveal just how complex this gets. A family might undergo ancestry DNA testing expecting to confirm their long-held beliefs about their ethnic identity, only to discover a complex admixture of genetic backgrounds that challenges everything they thought they knew. These experiences highlight the limitations of traditional racial categories and the importance of understanding genetic diversity. Rather than supporting the idea that racial categories are genetically real, these findings consistently demonstrate that genetic diversity is distributed across populations in ways that completely transcend racial boundaries. Now, let's address the pseudoscientific concept of genetic purity directly. The notion of genetic purity has no scientific basis whatsoever. All human populations have mixed ancestry. If you go back far enough, everyone's ancestry includes migration, intermixture, and genetic exchange. The very concept of purity implies that some populations are somehow unmixed or unchanged, which simply doesn't exist in human history. Moreover, genetic mixing isn't something that started recently with modern transportation. It's been a constant feature of human populations throughout history and prehistory. When archaeologists and geneticists examine ancient remains, they consistently find evidence of population movement and genetic exchange. The idea that any population was ever genetically pure is a myth that contradicts centuries of evidence. This has profound implications for how we think about human variation. Rather than thinking of humanity as divided into pure, genetically distinct races, we should think of humanity as displaying continuous genetic variation across geographic space. Genetic diversity is clinal, meaning it changes gradually across geography. As you travel from one region to another, genetic variation changes smoothly, not in discrete jumps. This makes arbitrary boundaries between racial categories meaningless from a genetic perspective. You can't draw a line on a map and say that people on this side are genetically different from people on that side. Genetic variation doesn't work that way. The evolutionary perspective on human genetic variation also helps clarify why racial categories are scientifically invalid. Human populations are not separate subspecies or even distinct evolutionary lineages. We're all members of the same species, Homo sapiens, and we've been geographically dispersed for a relatively short period of evolutionary time. 50,000 years might seem like a long time from a human perspective, but from an evolutionary perspective, it's remarkably brief. Not enough time has passed for major genetic divergence between populations. The amount of time required for populations to diverge into truly distinct types is on the order of millions of years, not thousands. Given that human populations have continued to interbreed and exchange genes throughout history, the conditions necessary for significant genetic divergence simply haven't existed. This brings us to an important point about human adaptation to environment. Yes, humans show phenotypic variation across the globe. People in different regions have different average skin colors, hair textures, and body shapes. These variations do reflect some degree of genetic adaptation to different environments, particularly regarding ultraviolet radiation exposure and climate. However, these adaptations involved relatively small numbers of genes and don't define races in any meaningful way. Moreover, These physical traits don't correlate with the vast majority of human genetic variation. Someone's skin color tells you virtually nothing about their genetic similarity to someone else or about what other traits they might share. The genes that produce visible differences like skin color represent only a tiny fraction of human genetic variation. Recent research from 2025 and 2026 continues to refine our understanding of genetic diversity in ways that further undermine racial categories. Studies examining fine-scale population substructure, when using genome-wide S&P data with different densities and different genetic markers, consistently reveal that population clusters reflect geography and linguistic ancestry more accurately than they reflect racial categories. When scientists from different countries analyze genetic data from their own populations, they invariably find that genetic variation within what might be called a racial group is greater than variation between different racial groups. This pattern holds for African populations, European populations, Asian populations, and every other region you might examine. The implications of all this research for medicine and healthcare are significant. Modern medicine needs to move away from using race as a proxy for genetic risk factors. Instead, medical research should focus on identifying specific genetic variants that influence disease, risk, and health outcomes. Some variants might be more common in certain populations due to ancestry and history, but this requires direct measurement and analysis, not assumptions based on self-identified race. When genomic data is available, it provides far more accurate information about disease risk than racial categories ever could. The future of personalized medicine depends on using actual genetic information rather than relying on crude racial categories. The history of how race and genetics became entangled also helps us understand why this misinformation persists. In the 18th and 19th centuries, various scientists proposed racial classification systems, including the famous system by Carl Linnaeus. These early attempts at racial classification were deeply flawed, but they were nonetheless influential. As Mendelian genetics was discovered and developed in the early 20th century, some people tried to apply genetic concepts to support racial hierarchies. These efforts culminated in the horrific pseudoscience used to justify eugenics movements and genocide. The scientific community has thoroughly rejected these applications of genetics, but the cultural legacy of linking genetics to race persists. Understanding this history is crucial because it shows us that the link between genetics and race was never scientifically justified. Even when people were trying to make this connection in the most aggressive ways, the evidence didn't support it. The evidence has only become clearer and more overwhelming since then. Yet misinformation about genetics and race continues to circulate, often in the form of sensationalized YouTube videos, pseudoscientific books, and misleading social media content. These sources often claim that scientists have discovered some shocking truth about racial genetics that proves race is real and genetically meaningful, but this is the opposite of what the actual science shows. Understanding this history is crucial because it shows us that the link between genetics and race was never scientifically justified. Even when people were trying to make this connection in the most aggressive ways, the evidence didn't support it. The evidence has only become clearer and more overwhelming since then. Yet misinformation about genetics and race continues to circulate, often in the form of sensationalized YouTube videos, pseudoscientific books, and misleading social media content. These sources often claim that scientists have discovered some shocking truth about racial genetics that proves race is real and genetically meaningful, but this is the opposite of what the actual science shows. The scientific consensus is crystal clear and has been for over 2 decades. Race is a social construct, not a biological reality rooted in genetics. This doesn't mean that race isn't important or real in social terms. Race is profoundly real as a social category that shapes people's experiences, opportunities, and health outcomes. But it's not real as a biological or genetic category. The racial categories we use today are products of history, politics, and social structure. They were invented to justify slavery and colonialism, and they persist due to social institutions and historical legacy, not because they reflect biological reality. Modern genetics has given us tools to understand human variation with unprecedented precision. These tools consistently show that human genetic variation is continuous, clinal, and distributed across geography, rather than organized into discrete racial categories. The tools show that all humans are deeply connected through shared ancestry and ongoing genetic exchange. The tools show that genetic variation within populations is greater than variation between them. The tools show that human populations have been constantly mixing and interbreeding throughout history. Every major finding in modern genetics undermines the idea that race is a meaningful biological category. Looking forward, the field of genetics is moving toward more inclusive and equitable research practices. Major initiatives like the All of Us research program are working to include diverse participants in genomic research to create more accurate and representative findings. Canadian precision health initiatives are working to include Indigenous peoples and their values in genetic research. Researchers are increasingly recognizing that understanding human genetic diversity requires studying people from all parts of the world, not just Europeans. This shift toward more inclusive genetics research will ultimately lead to better science and more equitable health outcomes for all populations. The story of race and genetics is ultimately a story about how science self-corrects. For a long time, genetic research was used or misused to support racial hierarchies. But as science advanced and better tools became available, the evidence became overwhelming and unambiguous. Race simply doesn't exist as a genetically meaningful category. The confusion between race and genetic ancestry, which persists in some parts of the public discourse, reflects outdated thinking and sometimes deliberately spread misinformation. But the actual science is clear, and it's been clear for decades. What DNA actually reveals about humanity is something far more profound and beautiful than racial hierarchy. It reveals that we're all connected to each other through shared ancestry that ultimately traces back to Africa. It reveals that every human being on Earth is related to every other human being, with the differences between us being far smaller than the similarities. It reveals that human diversity is a continuous spectrum, not a collection of separate types. It reveals that the traditional racial categories we've used are arbitrary human inventions that don't correspond to biological reality. And it reveals that our genetic variation reflects the incredible complexity of human history, with its migrations, mixtures, adaptations, and the constant exchange of genes across populations. This is what science actually shows us. This is what remains consistent across every major genetic study conducted over the past 2 decades. And this is the foundation of genuine scientific literacy regarding human genetics. When you hear claims about scientists ranking races by genetic purity or discovering shocking truths about genetic hierarchies, you can be confident that you're hearing misinformation. The real science is far more interesting. It's about understanding how humanity actually diversified, how populations actually moved and mixed, and how genetics actually works. And that real science tells us something profound. There's only one human race, and we're all part of it.